We have just about everybody here, so let me move into introducing today's speaker. We had Craig Genza yesterday from Denison,
Hey,
and today we
Matt,
have.
is it possible to for me to show some slides?
Yeah, I think you just have to like ask permission. I click a
Okay.
box there.
Let me figure out how to do that.
Yeah, because this came up yesterday with Craig. Okay, I changed permission, so you should be able to do it now. All right. So our speaker today, James Patterson, is the language program director in classics at Yale University. Before he returned to New England, because I believe, James, you are also a Massachusetts native originally. Yeah, like Craig yesterday. He received his PhD and taught as a lecturer at the University of Texas at Austin, which is where I first met him, actually. Before that, he received his BA and MAT from UMass Amherst. Nowadays, James works mostly on teaching-related projects, including two open educational resources. One is called Classics Teaching for Teacher Training at the college level, and the other is called Reading Morphologically on Teaching Greek from a Linguistics Approach. His research interests include religion in ancient Africa and the reception of Rome and the Maghreb and the Balkans. And I should add, he has been a tireless supporter of CAIM, helping to organize the annual meeting at Yale this past year, serving on the steering committee for the Summer Institute, and our current president-elect for CAIM. So let me introduce James Patterson.
Thank you very much. Can you see my slides? Is this visible? Yeah, it's all right. I'm just gonna, okay, so it works. Cool. Thank you very much for having me part of CSI. This is my first time attending or doing anything with it, so I'm excited to be here. So thanks again. The purpose of this talk ultimately will be to explain what I think is happening in Augustine's Confessions. By what I think is happening, I mean, for instance, how do we reconcile the two parts of the work and what I think the thing is about in the first place? If you know your Confessions, you probably know the first 9 books. In these, Augustine tells stories about his life, beginning with his infancy and youth in Africa. He was born in a town called Tagaste, which is modern-day Souk Ahras in Algeria. He tells us about the few years he spent as a professor of rhetoric in Italy, describes his conversion to Christianity, and concludes with the death of his mother on their return to Africa. Of course, these 9 books are followed by another 4 books. In those books, Augustine does not tell stories about his past, but instead ruminates on topics like memory, time, and the church. Consequently, few people read them. Yet these last 4 books account for more than 40% of the work as a whole, so surely they're not some irrelevant postscript that we can just skip. Though I think we often do that. I will conclude with the Confessions because, as I hope to show, it is very much a regional African work of literature that can't be divorced from that context, even if we typically do so. Augustine wrote the work around 400 CE while Bishop of Hippo Regius, which is modern Annaba in Algeria. He did so in response to very local concerns about martyrdom. So it should serve as a nice capstone to a larger discussion of martyrdom and politics in Roman Africa. Briefly, I define martyrdom as voluntary death in a perceived battle of good against evil. The martyr believes that in so dying, they will receive some special reward in the afterlife. In the Roman world, to be martyrs believed that Rome was the earthly manifestation of evil. Thus, martyrdom could occur when one died willfully fighting against Rome. The background image of my slides here is from Oxford University Press's graphic novel series. It depicts the climactic moment of the Passio Sanctarum, a popular martyr story from Carthage written around 200 CE. It is about the martyrdom of Perpetua and Felicity and others with them. Here in this image, Perpetua herself draws the gladiator's sword to her throat. And the text says, quote, so that she could taste some pain, Perpetua cried out, as she was pierced between the ribs. And she herself brought the wavering hand of the novice gladiator to her throat. No doubt such a woman, feared by a filthy spirit, couldn't have been killed unless she herself wanted it. Now, a question I'd like to explore is what sort of group or groups promoted and committed martyrdom. Christians, obviously, but not all. Only a minuscule fraction of Christians would ever have been willing to die for this or believed that Rome was the devil in the first place. And more often than not, the most immediate adversary of one group of Christians was another group of Christians, not non-Christians. So who were these people and why did they do this? Now let's begin by situating ourselves geographically. This will almost inevitably or naturally lead to a conversation about colonial and post-colonial ethnography. In turn, this will lay the groundwork for the question of what martyrdom is, who committed it, and why. There are misconceptions in the way Africa is presented in our literature, both ancient and modern, so hopefully this will clarify some things. The Latin term Africa may refer to the continent that we call Africa, but west of the Nile. Egypt was its own thing, or it was considered part of Asia. Africa may also refer to the region surrounding Carthage in Punic times, and subsequently the Roman province, roughly encompassing the top half of what is now Tunisia. To complicate matters, in the Christian period, there was also the ecclesiastical diocese called Africa that largely, but not entirely, coincided with the administrative borders of the province. The bishop of this diocese, centered at Carthage, oversaw the affairs of the other dioceses on the continent. To the east of this Africa, along the coast, and I'm keeping this geographical survey very simple, first we come to a region called Sirtica, later renamed Tripolitana, which extended along the southern coast of the Gulf of Sidra. East of that is Cyrenaica, in what is now northeastern Libya, then Marmarica, and was now northwestern Egypt, and then ancient Egypt itself from the Nile Delta running south along the river. Back to Africa, westward is Numidia and Gaetulia to its south, in what is now northeastern Algeria. West of that is Mauritania in northwestern Algeria and Morocco. This Mauritania is spelled with an E, not an I. Mauritania is a modern country south of Western Sahara or Morocco, depending on whom you ask. Note that much of what one says or does not say about this region, North Africa, and its history is politically charged, whether or not you want it to be. The focus of this talk will be on Africa and Numidia, not necessarily because martyrdom was more common here than elsewhere, though it probably was, but because the majority of our literature about martyrdom is from here. So that limits what we can say. Anyway, these regional boundaries are murky, often changing depending on who's in charge, where, and when. Roman provincial borders also change, and as a result, we get situations like Augustine, born in Tagaste in the province of Numidia, though that part of Numidia had previously been Africa, and though Tagaste was now in the province of Numidia, it was still part of the Diocese of Africa. With that in mind, how relevant were these regional divides to the identity of the people who live there? We might begin by asking to what degree these names are meaningful in the first place. Almost all of them are problematic in one way or another. Some are the names that Greeks used of the region, like Libya, Cyrenaica, and Aegyptos. The majority are the names Romans coined. Some of these derive from endonyms, or names the people called themselves, like Africa after the Afri, Gaetulia after the Gaetuli, and Mauritania after the Maori. The word Moor is still commonly used, but it has not so subtle racist and Islamophobic connotations that it should have been retired a long time ago. It might come as no surprise that Romans weren't great with foreign names, but don't take my word for it. In his Natural History, Pliny, the elder, says of Africa, quote, the names of its peoples and towns are entirely unpronounceable except in their own language. So don't expect these names to reflect actual endonyms. Other names are exonyms and typically derogatory. That is, they are names that Romans gave to people, not what these people called themselves. For instance, Punic is a derogatory exonym. The only piece of evidence we have for what they called themselves or their language or both, it's unclear, comes from Augustine around 400 CE, 1200 years after Carthage was founded. He says that a Punic speaker he was talking to said that they are, or their language is, Canaanite or Canaanite. Meanwhile, Numidian, or Numida in Latin, is the bastardization of the Greek nomos, which itself was a derogatory exonym, meaning iterant or wanderer. In a summary of the Numidian king Hiempsal II's history of Africa, Sallust claims that the Numidians gave themselves the names Numidae, but I find it unlikely that when naming themselves, they chose to do so by demeaning themselves in Latin. Names like Numidian and African and Gaetulian are meaningful among Latin speakers, but they don't necessarily or at all capture realities on the ground. Locals will use these names when speaking in Latin because the things that they describe, real or not, are understood by Latin speakers. Apuleius from Medauros, modern-day Mdarush in Algeria, called himself half Numidian, half Gaetulian to an audience who knew nothing about the region. That fact was actually part of his defense against the accusation that he practiced witchcraft. According to Brent Shaw, Tertullian and Cyprian, both from Carthage, used African only when it was from a foreigner's perspective. So we're starting to get the sense that these ethnonyms might not have much reality behind them. Take the fascinating case of one Gaius Iulius Gaetulus, a Roman citizen and soldier from Tullium, just north of Medauros, from perhaps the 2nd century CE. This is his tombstone, with Latin above and Libyc or Libyan below. Libyan is the indigenous language or language family of ancient North Africa, to which I'll return in a moment. In Latin, he is the Gaetulian. But in Libyan, if this reading is correct, he is Keti, son of Maswalat from the Misikiri and the subtribe of the Seremi. The script used for Libyan was an abjad, so all of these vowels are guesses, and we have no idea how these words were actually pronounced or accented. What we find here is a regional identity meaningful to Latin speakers, Gaetulian, versus a local identity presumably meaningful to Libyan speakers, Seremi of the Misikiri. Put another way, the Greek and Latin names cannot be trusted to describe a group of people as they would describe themselves. I don't just mean qualitatively. It is not always likely that the people whom outsiders group together ethnically would agree that they are, in fact, ethnically related, or that the supposed ethnic group exists in the first place. This is worth keeping in mind when we hear claims, for instance, about the Numidians doing this or that. While I'm on the topic of problematic names, Libyan is the diplomatic term for the indigenous language or languages of North Africa, and Libyc is the name of the script used to write them. They're diplomatic because there is no extant ancient nomenclature we can use for the language or the script, so using generic terms like these helps us avoid some modern political pitfalls. Non-linguists regularly call the language or languages not Libyan but Proto-Berber, as if it is certain that it is the ancestor of the modern Berber language of North Africa called Tamazight. That may very well be true, but so little is known about the ancient language that the association says more about contemporary Maghribi politics than it does anything historical. As for the script, in 1970, the Argwa Imazian, formerly the Berber Academy, developed the modern script called Tifinagh that you see here, based on the script used by the Tuareg in the Sahara. Nowadays, you find people regularly referring to this ancient script as Proto-Tifinagh, though they aren't exactly related. Again, this is more a matter of politics than anything else. I say all of this not just for fun. Nowadays, historians and non-historians alike tend to identify figures from ancient Africa as Berber, Tertullian, Augustine's mother Monica, the Donatists. But these designations are anachronistic and based on contemporary post-colonial politics. Alternatively, I worry that sometimes the use of these terms is a result of careless presumptions about ancient African ethnicity. As Ramzi Rouigi points out, we can't really talk about Berbers until the Middle Ages, about 700 in the first place. The reason I'm going on about this is as follows. If martyrdom was a religious act of political opposition against Rome, which it was, we might want to ask who these opponents were. In the 1970s, Abdullah Laouri and Marcel Benabou proposed that African Christianity was a form of anti-colonial resistance. And in a way, this is true, but the claim tends to be couched in terms similar to 20th century Maghribi resistance against France. And that is not analogous. Elsewhere, we find claims about, quote, the Church of the Martyrs spreading among the ancient Berbers, or that one church was African and another church was Numidian. Whatever ethnic divisions existed, and I'm sure there were plenty, we have no way of finding out what they were. So in short, we can say that the ethnonyms we do have at our disposal just don't work. We also don't know exactly what happened when people were martyred. All that survives are highly rhetorical stories championing martyrdom. These are called martyr narratives. They were written in Latin by educated Romans. So martyrdom turns out to be an issue of, unhelpfully, Roman versus Roman. So this begs now the question, what do we mean by Roman? If by Roman we refer to people of the city of Rome, we limit ourselves to a relatively small and somewhat insignificant or irrelevant population. By Roman, I assume we usually mean citizens of or those who otherwise participated in the socio-political and economic entity with the city of Rome at its center, at least for a while. In this regard, there might be degrees of Romanness. You might never go to Rome or even speak Latin, yet still be a Roman more or less. Your customs and style might be a blend of imperial Roman and local non-Roman, or you code switch culturally between the two, as we saw Ketty do. Perhaps it is better to describe Romanness as a spectrum. It is often customary to think in terms of binaries, black and white, good and evil, Roman and non-Roman, or barbarian, but this is not quite how ethnographic rhetoric works. When writing about a conquered adversary, Roman historians would insert said adversary between Roman and barbarian. This adversary was like us, O Romans, but not quite. They allied with barbarians, but themselves were not. And this was a literary way that they could justify colonialism. With our help, O Romans, they can actualize their full potential and eventually become Roman like us. They're just not virtuous enough to do it on their own. Were they in fact barbarians, we, O Romans, would have no reason to bring them into our fold. So for instance, when Livy talks about the Second Punic War, Hannibal exhibits lots of Roman virtues, but has a fatal flaw that keeps him from reaching his full Roman potential. Livy doesn't call him or the Carthaginians barbarians, but they ally with barbarians, namely the Numidians. When Sallust wrote about Jugurtha, the Numidian prince who fought against Rome and whose defeat resulted in the Roman conquest of Numidia, Sallust never calls Jugurtha or the Numidians barbarian. Rather, Sallust's version of Jugurtha displays many Roman virtues, yet isn't quite Roman. He allies with barbarians. In this case, now, the barbarians are the Gaetuli and the Mauri, but he himself is not one. We find similar tripartitions in post-colonial frameworks as well. Frantz Fanon and Albert Memmi, two of the most prominent thinkers during and after the wars of independence from France, describe the so-called colonized intellectual. He or she, the colonized intellectual, is embedded and educated in the world of the colonizer and serves as an intermediary between the colonized and the colonizer, interpreting the former for the latter. Their identity as colonized has been muddied, and they can never actually be colonizers. So they exist somewhere uncomfortably between the two. Mimi himself, a Jewish Berber Tunisian, might very well have been called a colonized intellectual. In his On the Cloak, Tertullian of Carthage, writing around 200 CE, discussed something similar. Locals who threw aside the traditional cloak for the fashionable toga. Tertullian captures the desire to be more Roman with the term Romanitas, which he uses as a critique, not as a praise. Today, we use the term Romanitas for the customs and values that make a person Roman, but that misses the context in which Tertullian understood and used the term. Anyway, in all of these cases, we find an intermediary existing between those who colonize and those who are colonized. Someone who is forced or who willfully tries to enter the world of the colonizer. In the Christian world, that gives rise to martyrdom. In the Christian world that gives rise to martyrdom, we find the opposite, a Roman cutting ties with certain features of their Romanness, and thus creating a rebellious intermediary within the Roman sphere. Let's look at the opening of the Passio Sanctarum. Note the attempt to establish a new literary tradition with scripture as its foundation, nothing classically Roman or Greek, and the martyr narrative now as the new literary genre. It says, if the old examples of faith, which both testify to the grace of God and lead to the edification of humans, were written down so that by reading them, God should be honored and a person comforted through a re-examination of those deeds, should we not set down new acts that serve each purpose equally? For these too will someday also be venerable and compelling for future generations, even if at the present they are judged to be of lesser importance, due to the respect naturally afforded the past. What I find particularly telling about this and other martyr narratives like it is the literary and stylistic Romanness that it betrays. This here, this opening to the Passio is so rhetorical that for a while it was presumed to be written by Tertullian. However, our authors may have identified themselves ethnically, they were raised and educated as upper class Romans. This literature is very much meant for that audience, Roman Christians who operated in and resisted Rome via a sort of de-Romanization. The Passio Sanctarum is one of dozens of martyr narratives written to describe the arrest, trial, and death of a Christian who willfully dies for Jesus in the fight against Rome. The Passio is by far the most literarily elaborate of these narratives, but it follows the same generic framework that even the most simple martyr narrative follows. That framework goes like this. And I should again stress that these stories are literary creations, perhaps reflecting real events more or less, but perhaps not. I always like that in the case of the Passio, your two main characters are Perpetua and Felicitas, whose names together mean eternal happiness. Nice coincidence. The protagonist of a martyr narrative is a community leader, often a bishop, but not necessarily. He or she is a person of upstanding character, epistemologically certain with an almost excessive degree of confidence. That is, he or she seems almost to know God personally. The existence, by the way, of female martyrs posed a praised above bishops even, will be a real problem for the establishment. So that's worth keeping in mind. The genre follows a fairly strict narrative movement with these plot points. First, we have the arrest and trial of the to-be martyr. And here it is worth recalling that martyr originally means witness in a courtroom setting. So the martyr narrative is a sort of religious legal text. During the trial, the to-be martyr professes his or her faith and therefore his or her identity. The to-be martyr declares not who he or she is, but what he or she is, namely a Christian. The authorities give the person a way out. That's an important feature of this. because the key point is that the to-be martyr insists on death. If taken kicking and screaming, he or she would not be a martyr. So it is critical that the story presents death as the martyr's choice. Once sentenced, sometimes they experience a vision of paradise, not always, but sometimes. The narrative then ends with their execution and joy. This is not a sad story. We, the readers, rejoice, happy that the martyr has been born. To explain what I mean by that, let's turn to the worldview that informs this behavior. This picture of heaven, I think, illustrates Dante's Divine Comedy. I throw it up here just to give you something new to look at. To Christians who support martyrdom, the world in which we currently live is one of sin, suffering, and pain. When a person dies, they go to the underworlds without reward or punishment, regardless of how they lived in this life. This world, the world of the living, is a battlefield between the forces of good and evil. Again, Rome was the earthly manifestation of evil, and the martyrs fought on the side of good against it. Eventually will come the apocalypse, a cataclysmic event marking the victory of good over evil, and this will usher in a new world. The more moderate and doubtless more popular view was that the apocalypse would be political. That is, the apocalypse would see the collapse of the status quo of Roman imperial governance and a surrender of it to the forces of Jesus. This is how some Christians interpreted the Edict of Milan in 313, when Constantine decriminalized Christianity and ended the persecutions, at least for those Christians who supported him. Persecutions definitely still continued to happen. This political apocalypse was further reinforced by the Edict of Thessalonica in 380, when Theodosius I made Nicene Christianity the official state religion. Accordingly, the age of martyrs had come to an end. Today, however, we probably think of apocalypse as something far more spectacular: fire and brimstone, the conflagration of the world, and the return of paradise on earth. Paradise is an old Persian word that means enclosed garden, like Eden, or the Greek Golden Age, where humans hang out with God. This eschatological apocalypse includes the judgment of the dead. Those who have been good in life are reborn into paradise, while the underworld becomes hell for those who were not. Martyrdom operates on this understanding of apocalypse. By dying in the battle of good versus evil, the martyr not only earns a special place in the paradise to come, he or she enters paradise now, upon death, rather than having to wait in the underworld for the apocalypse like the rest of us. Dying in this way, the martyr creates a sort of temporal wormhole where their human remains in this world allow us to participate, however minimally, in the paradise they currently enjoy that's in our future. Accordingly, people then will venerate the bones of martyrs and be buried close to them. This is a martyrium in Tipasa, Algeria, near Yol, Caesarea, and Mauritania. It's just west of Algiers. It is hard to see, but in the center is the tomb of a martyr, and the martyr's fans are buried around it. The death days of martyrs were celebrated. Augustine describes these as heavy drinking parties where he'd go to try to pick up girls. Martyrdom was such a feature of African Christianity, more so than anywhere else in the empire, that on average, one martyr party occurred every 5 days, so frequently that even Augustine's congregation grew tired of the constant partying. And with that, let's turn to Augustine and his world. Augustine was born in 354 in Tagaste. He went to school in nearby Medaros, the birthplace of Apuleius, and then in Carthage, where he would go on to teach rhetoric. From there, he moved to Italy to take up what he thought would be a better teaching position with better students. He ended up thinking that they also were pretty bad. First at Rome and then at Milan, where his mother Monica joined him. He converted to Christianity, quit his job eventually 1 year later, and returned to Africa. Sadly, on their return, Monica, his mother, died at Ostia, and this is where the historical narrative of the Confessions ends. Now back in Tagaste, hoping to live a quiet life of intellectual contemplation, Augustine established a monastic community with his son and some of his friends. But then his son died, and his best friend died. Forlorn, he moved to Hippo Regius on the coast and reluctantly became bishop of the Caecilianist church there, tasked with addressing the so-called Donatist controversy. I'll explain what those terms mean in just a moment. It was while embroiled in debates with the Donatists that he wrote the Confessions between the years 397 and maybe 404, just before he helped condemn the Donatists by imperial decree. Although nowhere in the Confessions does he mention the Donatists by name, they will have been forefront on his mind. What we know about the Donatists, the predominant Christian group in Africa, comes to us from what their opponents said about them. Because the Donatists were eventually condemned as heretics, their own writings are almost entirely lost. So we really must be careful when reading this anti-Donatist material. What we know is that when Augustine returned to Africa as a Christian, he found that Donatism dominated the African church. Essentially, the Donatists held that the empire had not capitulated to Jesus in 313. Rather, those who capitulated were the Christians who now associated with the empire, like the Caecilianists. Consequently, for Donatists, the war was still on. Thus, they claimed to be the true church of the martyrs. But of course, things weren't quite that simple. The Donatist controversy began in Carthage in the aftermath of the great persecutions of Diocletian from 303 to 305. At that time, imperial officials asked leaders of problematic communities to hand over scripture for destruction. Most were priests because it was easiest to subjugate a community by going after its leader, and priests were more likely to possess things like books. Those who turned over scripture to the authorities would be called traditores, betrayers or traitors. Those who did not may have been martyred, but probably weren't. When the persecutions ended, a question arose about what to make of the status of traditores, since they had effectively surrendered to evil. What seems to have been the standard view in Africa was that the sacraments of the priest who committed traditio, like the Eucharist or baptism or ordination, would no longer be valid, but the priest could partly remedy things by getting rebaptized. The minority view, though the view held by the empire, was that baptism was a singular event, so rebaptism was out. However, what is conferred through the sacraments, this is their view, is conferred not by the human performing the ritual, but by Jesus. So even a traditor could, in theory, perform the Eucharist or ordain a priest. In probably 307, there was a contested election for the new bishop of Carthage. Recall that the bishop of Carthage oversaw the affairs of the other African dioceses, so this election concerned Christians broadly. The story goes that the Carthaginians excluded the Numidians from the election and selected a deacon of the Carthaginian church, a man named Caecilian, to be the next bishop. But Caecilian had an enemy, a woman named Lucilla, whom he once chastised for kissing the bone of a martyr before the Eucharist. Put another way, he was suppressing the worship of martyrs. Lucilla bribed, this is the story, don't believe it, Lucilla bribed the excluded Numidians to oppose Caecilian's ordination. They came to Carthage, claimed that the man who ordained Caecilian had himself been a traditor, and this then rendered the ordination of Caecilian invalid. So the Numidians ordained one of Lucilla's friends bishop of Carthage instead. The story goes that they set up a table in the street and then held the ordination there. which is actually funny because you can do that. Ancient North African altars had where you could move them, so there's post holes in churches. So I guess theoretically you could take the wooden altar out of a church, set it up in the street, and actually ordain someone there. Anyway, they ordained Lucilla's friend, Mairinus, Bishop of Carthage, competing with Caecilian. This man, Mairinus, soon died and was replaced by Donatus. So from this point forward, we have two competing churches. One, the Caecilianists that followed Caecilian and his successors, another Donatist that followed Donatus and his successors. At first, the Donatists weren't actually anti-imperial, but this is always the narrative. Donatus himself appealed to the emperor 3 times to invalidate the ordination of Caecilian. We have these letters, but he was shot down each time. In 346, he asked the emperor for recognition as the true Church of Africa. So again, he's still trying to get Roman approval for what he's doing. An imperial commission was sent to Africa to restore unity, but this led to bloodshed and Donatists were martyred. The story goes, and again, take this with a grain of salt, that violent gangs called the Circumcillians fought with the Donatists against the empire. And here we might want to recall the tripartition I mentioned before. We have now the Donatists allying with barbaric Circumcillians in their fight against Rome. The Donatist church was subsequently suppressed until Julian the Apostate came, who restored it in the early 360s, but the narrative was set. Rome, the devil, had in fact not capitulated. Rather, the Caecilianists had joined the dark side. It is against this view that Augustine, the Caecilianist bishop of Hippo Regius, had to contend. Augustine wrote the Confessions between the years 397 and 404. I think I already mentioned that. At the height of the Donatist controversy, the 13 books that comprise the work are an extended conversation between Augustine and a frustratingly unresponsive God. In the first 9 books, he ruminates on events from his past. Some are significant, like his conversion to Christianity in Book 8 and the mystical vision of heaven he experienced with his mother just before her death in Book 9. Others are seemingly less significant, like how as an infant he craved breast milk. That's in Book 1. Or the time he stole some pears, which takes up almost all of Book 2. He plays up his troubled youth, quote unquote, lusting after women, hanging out with the cool kids, enjoying theater, and having no clue what God might be trying to say in Scripture. It is only through so many tears and so much anguish, along with the guidance of his mother, he wasn't able to do any of this on his own, that eventually he comes around to Christianity. But oh my God, this takes forever. Contrast this with the martyr exemplar, championed by the Donatists, a leader of upstanding character who knows God with confidence. In the Confessions, there is certainly a trial, but that trial is in his own mind against himself. And that, I think, is precisely the point. On Augustine's view, Rome has capitulated, but paradise is not here yet. With Rome out of the picture, the war is no longer external, it is now internal. So the fight must go on, but in a contemplative way. He doesn't die, but his mother does, just after the two experience a vision of heaven together. As she dies, Augustine asks what he should do with her body, and she responds effectively, who cares? Contrast this with the reception of a martyr's body, which we want to touch, worship, and generally be around. Notably, the historical narrative of the first 9 books of the Confessions does not end with Augustine's conversion or baptism. It ends here with the death of his mother. From here on out, Augustine no longer tells stories from his past, though 10 significant years passed between his mother's death and the time he began writing this. Although we don't hear stories of his life during these years, nothing really changes in the narrative, to be honest. He is still asking God questions, still getting no answers, and he stumbles to find solutions to his own questions himself. Perhaps then the Confessions is a new way to understand the claim that life does not end with the death of the body. In Book 11, Augustine attempts to define time We all know what time is, he says loosely, until we try to define it, and then we don't. Approaching this question of time, he uses so-called A-series terms, so past, present, and future, rather than the maybe more common scientific B-series, before, simultaneous with, and after. Using these terms, Augustine concludes that the only time that exists is a durationless present. This is because any present time, like an hour or a minute or a second, will itself have a past, present, and future. So when we reduce that time just to its present, ultimately we end up with a timeless present, or an eternity. So oddly, we exist at an internal present, yet somehow we also experience time. Augustine explains this experience as a product of memory. We remember the past via present memories of it and anticipate the future via expectations that we form from our present memories. This passage here isn't exactly relevant, but it will be later. It's him talking about how he's able to narrate his past in the first place. The result of this non-existent past and future, where we're remembering it through our present and so on and so forth, creates a sort of distraction that Augustine famously calls distentio animi. Philosophers like to claim that this is a poor translation of a Stoic or Platonic term, but it's just a Latin word. It means stretching or swelling of the mind. But God and truth exist at the present timelessly. The swelling of our minds away from this timeless present toward past and future times that don't exist, that's what causes us psychological anguish. If perhaps we could reverse that swelling, we might get closer to God and truth while we are still alive. Indeed, he describes the vision of heaven he and his mother experienced at Ostia as an inward journey through the corporeal world within his mind, namely memory of past events, to the incorporeal until they touch an infinite ictus, or beat, that is the lives of the saints in heaven. In other words, in this vision, they momentarily attain the eternal present without change or distraction. So while maybe we'll live in that world after death, I should add that Augustine has an awkward philosophical view of heaven that is quite unlike the nice rolling hills and sun that we might normally associate heaven with. Perhaps we can still touch heaven now intellectually, this is Augustine thinking, without having to die literally. In this way, the Confessions proposes, indeed, I think it performs, a bloodless alternative to traditional martyrdom. So how might one go about actually doing this? In Book 10, Augustine depicts autobiographical narration as a confrontation with memories of his past. Here, he describes how he enters the metaphorical space of his mind. He'll depict this sometimes as a military camp or a granary, filled with closets and stuffed full of junk. He calls forth the memories he wishes to narrate. He gives them order through narration, perhaps to give some stability to the confusion of his mind. Here, I think the idea is that if we existed a timeless present, that present makes sense to God, but not for us, because ours is always changing and it's a mess, because memory is always fluid and so on and so forth. So maybe by doing some spring cleaning, we can decrease the swelling of our minds. I'm reminded in this material, especially this passage, but frankly, throughout the Confessions as a whole, of the sixth book of Virgil's Aeneid. With the Sibyl as his guide, Aeneas confronts the ghost of his past, the ghosts that have haunted him throughout the first 5 books. Once he finds Elysium, the Sibyl's knowledge ends, and Aeneas looks to the future with the help of his father Anchises. Something in Aeneas then seems to change, for in the remainder of the Aeneid, Aeneas no longer looks backward. Something similar seems to be happening with Augustine. By confronting his past through autobiographical narration, he is able to move on from it and focus on the present. Death will come eventually, but we don't have to die now in order to find God, I think is what he might say. So very briefly, by way of a conclusion, how is this political? Martyrdom, at least as it is presented in the extant literature, is an act of defiance from within one political order, encouraging the formation of another political order. Martyrdom lies at the heart of Christianity, beginning with Jesus himself, the first martyr. So when the new political order arrives, martyrdom can't quite go away. Instead, it must be reconceived as something tolerable and consistent with the new political order. That, I believe, is what Augustine has proposed in his Confessions. So in response to the question of how is this political, I might ask, how is it not? Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, James, for a fascinating lecture. One thing that's always interested me about these kind of narratives that I was thinking about throughout the talk is, as you say, this, attempting to form a new political order with some kind of instrumentality of the old. But even the way that a lot of these are presented and narrated, it's using the Roman discourse of exemplarity, but of course in a very new and different way for virtues and moral stances that, Livy, for example, would find very strange.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's really important. I mean, again, considering that all of these authors were raised, educated on with Latin literature, that's what they know. That's how they write. It's worth also then so that would inevitably be, if they're going to try to shape like the heroic qualities of a martyr, that's what they'd be thinking about. It's also worth keeping in mind, I think, that one of the reasons that Augustine says that it took him so long to convert to Christianity because the literature of Scripture was just so bad. Jerome says the same thing. I mean, if you read it, so if you're like, it's by bad, I mean, it's just like not very artful from for someone like Augustine. And here, I think part of what like Augustine's projects generally and others is doing is to create literature that is like enjoyable to read for a Christian audience, that might be like of higher quality and so on. And of course, again, if they're the literature of Scripture is foreign to the Latin audience, so if they're going to try to create something, of course they're going to create it with a Roman mold.
And then there's that, that whole tension, I think it's summed up in that dream that Jerome has, where he's accused of being, non-Christianus, said Ciceronianus instead.
Sure.
Yeah. All right. Other questions for James? Thank you.
John.
Yeah, can I bring up something here?
Yeah.
That was really, really good, and it reminded me, as you will appreciate, of what we're doing in the course that we are studying the fire of Rome and the persecution of the Christians and the apocalypse, and whether or not Nero is the beast of the apocalypse. We seem to be thinking that maybe that there was no actual persecution under Nero at all. This is not an original idea. There are people thinking that. But the story of it appears in Tacitus 50 years later, And in between the fire and the Tacitian account, we have the writing of the Apocalypse of John, the book of Revelation. Um, do you think I'm thinking on I'm sitting down, but thinking on my feet here. Um, is there a connection there? If we're going to have an apocalyptic view of things, do we need martyrs? And so is the story of martyrs coming in as the early Christian church is acquiring more and more of an apocalyptic attitude? Not that it wasn't there beforehand, and not that there weren't people who were dying before then, but we didn't have a huge number of martyrs um, until, well, end of the first, beginning of the second century. Does that make sense to you?
So is your question, what is, you would ask, do we really need martyrs? Was
Yeah,
that?
if we're going to have an apocalypse, which
Mhm.
is the book of Apocalypse is very political,
Right, right.
and anti-Roman.
Mhm.
So do we need martyrs to validate that, or to
Yeah, right.
so that we're serious?
I think, I don't, one thing about martyrdoms is extremely selfish. You do it so that you get a better place in the afterlife. And then sure, your community might get a little touch of that by playing with your bones, but it is a very selfish thing.
Mhm.
And it's modeled after, I mean, if we're going to say, be as like Jesus as possible, he martyred himself, so why don't I? So if we're thinking about it that way, it's not, you know, I should also step back and just reiterate again that we are always working with literary narratives about martyrdom and what people were actually doing. And one thing to keep in mind too, you had mentioned that how many people actually died in these things. You got to be playing this stuff up pretty significantly. I think off the sort of intensity of these stories probably doesn't necessarily reflect reality. I think that's probably likely. If I'm reading Tertullian, I'm not really thinking that this is actually what the world is like. But that's, yeah, is there a need for martyrdom? I don't know. I don't know what they would say, but it is beneficial. I think
Mhm.
though, thinking about martyrs, it just seems like in any context, pretty hardcore if you're going to die for a cause,
Mhm. Mhm.
especially knowing how painful it would be. So I just sort of wonder about people who would do this. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. No, thank you.
What others? Fred?
Yeah. Uh, the one year I was substituting for Nancy Snyder Irons in Reading, and it was time for the kids to read the Diaries of Perpetua. And one of the things that I think the commentary said that was that Augustine testified to the veracity, I guess, of the diary, that that he knew of it somehow. Do you know, James, where that is somewhere? I haven't read that much of Augustine, so I don't know.
I'm not sure where that exact passage is, but I mean, the Postio Sanctorum is floating around, being modified in different forms. We have like martyr narratives they're often updated, and there's like a Donatist version, and there's this other version out here,
Yeah.
and so on and so forth. So the study of the Postio itself is like, it's very like a fluid document.
Okay.
No doubt he I don't know that exact passage, but it would not surprise me whatsoever, considering how like ornate and like prominent that is. There's no reason though to think that it maybe there was some person named perpetuum felicitas and optatus and so on and so on. But like, obviously, you know, the story itself is obviously very like unreal. But yeah, well, I mean, in the sense that like, it's very much like, these stories you read in like Roman historians where it's like, this is what they said behind closed doors. Well, how would they have known that? You know, like, so when you have these narratives about like what actually people did when they, anyway, it's, you just have to always keep in mind that like these things are, think about how like Romans were thinking about history too. Like we're talking, this is what so-and-so would have said, not necessarily what they actually said. And that's not much of a problem for them. They don't see that as like some false narrative. So anyway, we need to keep all this stuff in mind when assessing these things. And then,
I was always astonished that they were able to read it in a public school in Massachusetts, but then it was by a woman.
there's a series, I have a whole like collection of these images of like the children's versions nowadays of these, and of course they're like I was actually going to put a picture of one in the slides, where it's like, you know, two girls who are like scared and, you know, so on, and it's very much like a sad tragic story, which of course it's not supposed to be. But yeah, it is kind of weird how, like, if you step back, I mean, nowadays I think it's kind of odd, like, to go into all these buildings and just see like statues of some guy bleeding on a cross. I mean, if you think about it, that if you really are able to remove yourself and take a kind of like etic perspective, like some of this stuff is kind of weird.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions for James?
No, that was great.
And yeah, let me second Fred's assessment right there. This was a fascinating, thought-provoking lecture, and very much appreciate you joining us today, James, and all the work that you've done both for the Summer Institute and for Kane. Remember,
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Remember, everybody, we've got our Greek reading group and Latin reading group going on right now. I'm going to start the Latin reading group up right now on Zoom. The Greek one is all set with Mary Grace. If you won't be joining us for that, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you tomorrow morning for day 3 of the Summer Institute. Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Good night.
Thank you.